Shall we begin with the Fighting Irish?
Okay.
Is that good? That good? All right. Quick clarification. As always, I'm going to turn to Bud Elliott. I'm sorry to put you on the spot here. Are we Buckner? Tyler Buckner?
Yeah.
Buckner. Okay. This is a good time for me to make sure that I get all of my pronunciation down because I do a lot of reading. Got to admit, I'm not always looking up the YouTubes, and obviously I'm not in charge of talking to these guys or so. But the reason I mention his name, if you are not familiar, he is a very highly rated true freshman quarterback that Notre Dame not only has, but has on campus for the spring. But that's not all when it comes to replacing Ian Book, because we've got former Wisconsin quarterback Jack Cohn. So we've got the elder statesman, the graduate transfer on campus for spring, and we've got Tyler Buckner, the young buck, coming in, early enrollee, and all spring long, who's getting how many reps? Back and forth. That will be something that a lot of people are interested in. I'm not as interested in that, but of course I recognize the significance, especially given us being a little bit of a Jack Cohn fan podcast, at least going into last season, where we thought that before his injury, he could be someone that was very effective based on his 2019 performance. And then of course, recognizing Buckner's ceiling. Elsewhere that I'm looking at. So Notre Dame has become an offensive line factory. You lose All-Americans. You still got Jarrett Patterson. I mean, he can play at an All-American level. But the questions that I have for that offensive staff are going to be how they shuffle those pieces around, because there's a lot of intriguing talent. Again, we have done a great job at that position at Notre Dame. What are the pieces going to look like? I don't have any single players that I'm looking at to necessarily slide into certain spots, but there does appear to be some uncertainty as to who the five is, what positions they are in. But again, it sure seems like cousin Jarrett will be that sort of All-American player there. Big staff hire, Marcus Freeman, one of the top defensive coordinators in the entire country. He's brought over by Brian Kelly from Cincinnati. Offensively, outside of quarterback, still got Kyron Williams, still got Chris Tyree, still got Michael Mayer. Like the idea that we're running with like running backs and tight ends and trying to build from sort of the inside out rather than the outside in, that sure seems to be the case. But there is an absence of outside playmakers. I'm not expecting it, at least not to see it this spring. But if we're going to talk about overall success and how Notre Dame stacks up against its peers at the top of the country, certainly something that you would like to see as a Notre Dame fan. So for the Fighting Irish, they are back to their independent ways. ACC schedule. Thanks. Enjoyed it. Made it to the ACC title game. Took down Clemson, but now we're going to open things up again. How are we feeling about the Fighting Irish, and where are our eyes and ears for spring practice?
I think this is a really interesting season for Notre Dame, especially with what we've seen the program doing in the last few years with its recruiting and how it's stepped up. Because we've seen in the past in the Brian Kelly era that they had great seasons, and then they would have kind of like a reset year, or maybe sometimes even two, and then they would get back to being like 10 wins. Like they had they went to the national title game in 2012. They won 9 games, I think, in 2013. Then they had an 8-5 season. Then they jumped back up to 10. Then they dropped to 4-8, and ever since then they've had 4 straight 10-win seasons at least. But like we look at the returning production rankings, like you mentioned, all the stuff that they lose. Ian Book obviously is a big part of that, but in Connolly's returning production rankings, they're 123rd nationally. Like they lost a lot from that team last year at a lot of key spots, and there's a lot to replace. Obviously, the QB competition is huge, but I want to see, because like this is something we talked about the last couple of years about how they've stepped up on the recruiting to kind of become more of a program that could compete with the elite to get to the college football playoff and maybe win some games and maybe win a national title. So if you're truly at that point, if the way you've been recruiting to get to that point, I feel like this is our first litmus test of how successful Notre Dame's new approach and plan has been. Because if they can replace everything that they lose from that team last season and still come out and know they're not playing an ACC schedule this year, but they're still playing a pretty difficult schedule, and win 10 games and 11 games and be in the playoff picture, I think that's huge. But that's more of a macro look at it. Micro level, I was high on Jack Cohn at Wisconsin. I thought he was capable of doing more than Wisconsin asked. But I also kind of looked at that from the context of Wisconsin, of being a Wisconsin quarterback, of what you're asked to do at Wisconsin. At Notre Dame, I don't know if Jack Cohn kind of meshes with what I think Notre Dame sees itself trying to be. And I don't know if I think he might start the season as a starter, but I think if you're a Notre Dame fan, you're hoping Buckner it plays so well this spring and this summer and fall that at some point he takes that job over. But so that's going to be interesting to me. But I also think you touched on it a bit too, Chip. The receiver position. Yes, they've got Kyron Williams back. Yes, they've got Michael Meyer back. They've got their tight ends. They're big behemoths. But somebody needs to emerge on that offense as an outside perimeter threat down the field. Until they have that, it's going to be very difficult for them to really truly compete with the best, programs in the country. So will somebody emerge there finally this year? They thought they had that last year with Kevin Austin. He got hurt, and now hopefully he's healthy. He's able to stay on the field this year and become that guy, because somebody needs to step up and take on that role if this Notre Dame offense is, especially without Ian Book, is going to really take that step forward.
I think Tom hit on something pretty important here with the lack of the outside receiver threat. And when you look at Bill's returning production numbers, look, the projection systems are always going to be better than the humans working without the numbers, right? But the optimal strategy is to use the numbers and then, make some human adjustments that make logical sense. And one of the ones that I would make for this team is that I would discount the production lost from the receiver position, because the guys that they lost primarily were dudes who were backups entering the season, right? Not only to Tom's point, Kevin Austin, right, who they certainly missed quite a bit, and Kevin, physically is pretty freaky. They also were missing Braden Lindsey, who played. I mean, Lindsey and Kevin Austin combined for 8 catches on the year. I mean, they were probably expecting both those guys to be 35, 45 catch players apiece. So that was a significant blow to the Irish. And it's something that, I know we talked about, I'm sure you guys did too at CBS. Look, when it comes for them to play a really, really elite team, they don't have it. And it's not to say they didn't recruit it, but they don't have it on the field at the minute because their 2 guys they were counting on were hurt. So that's kind of the first point I would make. I think there's a reason for optimism with this team based on some explosiveness returning there on the outside, or at least some assumed explosiveness. They're not exactly proven studs, but we think they're pretty good. And they were going to start for the Irish, before they got hurt. The other thing I would point to here that I think could help them avoid a massive drop off is let's take a look at their win expectancy from their games last year. They didn't just go, they didn't just win or lose just 2 games. They were completely dominant against everybody for the most part who was not Clemson or Alabama, right? 83% over Duke, 100% USF, 99% Florida State, 100% Pitt, 100% Georgia Tech, 97 Boston College, 99 UNC, 99 Syracuse. Now, Louisville was weird. I'll grant you that. The wind was blowing so bad that day they couldn't throw the ball, and I think Brian Kelly just said, "Screw it! Like, we're just going to run and win this thing." I don't think he thought they would win 12-7, but that's what.
Oh no, that was 1916, baby. Like, that was football from another era.
Yeah.
Like,
no, that
I was waiting for you.
1 for 5 in the red zone that day.
What was the win expectancy then? Because I can tell you, watching it, I never thought Louisville was going to win. The score suggested that Louisville was in that game, and I don't know if once I really thought the Cards were going to do anything.
I thought the only chance was if some of these throws were hitting the goalpost, right? Like the wind was so crazy. Okay, this is kind of weird. Like, there could be some strange things happen due to the wind. But my overarching point here is, let's say that Notre Dame does drop down. Last year, the metrics saw them as the 16th best team in the country. The rankings saw them, far higher. Let's say they still play as a top 25 level team, or even a top 15 level team, perhaps. The thing is, if they drop down some, they're still going to be a pretty significant favorite in almost all their games. So, yes, you'll still lose to the Clemsons or Bamas if you meet them, most likely, given how much you lost off last year's roster. But I don't think that the gap is narrowed that much against the other teams on the Irish's schedule. And I'm interested to see if they can answer some of those questions in spring that Tom brought up. But I still have fairly high hopes for this football team.
Yeah, because honestly, if you look at their schedule right now, based on what we know. I don't know what game right now they wouldn't be favored in. Like maybe in the opener against Florida State on the road, but I have
No,
to think
I still think they'll be
there.
favored. If you give me Notre Dame as a dog, I'm unloading on that.
Maybe Wisconsin at Soldier Field. That would be a game where they're not favored, but they
Is that early in the year?
Yeah, that's in the end of September.
Yeah, I would have Wisconsin as a favorite over Notre Dame at this point, just in my head.
They get Cincinnati at home, so they should be favored there. They get USC at home, probably favored. North Carolina at home, they're probably favored. Other than that, everything else looks like they're clearly favored against other opponents.
I mean, this team plays to its potential. I think, it doesn't have like a 5-7, 6-6 type floor. It probably has like an 8-4 type floor and, a 10-2, 11-1 type ceiling within that range.